It's your boy Double D coming at you from Site B, as the OGGM would put it, aka my kitchen. Well, it seems like it might be over. Kyle Brink's Wizards of the Coast apology tour is through. And I think you'd have to concede that overall, it was probably a success in their eyes. Kyle made one gigantic blunder.
This is not the face of the hobby anymore. And I think there's been mistakes made in years past where people assumed that D&D players were all, white dudes in a basement, which has been a faulty assumption for a lot of years and gets more and more false every day. And so it's, in my viewpoint, honestly, guys like me can't leave soon enough.
But by simply pretending it didn't happen with a group of sympathetic YouTubers to give him cover, he seems to have pulled out of that tailspin. You do have to hand it to Wizards of the Coast, as they knew all the right buttons to push. They realized they still commanded a lot of awe and respect in some folks' eyes, and they chose their interview targets well. Ones that would, let's just say, not exactly come out of the gate firing.
Community was who they hurt the most, and that's why they wanted to have these conversations with the community, and they called me a pillar of the D&D community. I'm sure it's the same email that went to everybody.
We always provide our questions ahead of time, though I did send them this morning, so you haven't had all that much time to prep, sorry. But we did provide you our questions, and we said that anything that you don't want to answer, you're absolutely welcome to say, life is complicated.
It's about to start. I am nervous.
Kyle, what are your top 2 favorite TTRPGs besides Dungeons & Dragons?
What's worse, it appears that almost all of the interviewers unbelievably colluded on their questions.
Now, I will also say that I worked with several other creators, Jenny D, Bob Worldbuilder, and a few others, to kind of coordinate, talk things out.
Now, they would tell you that they did this to avoid overlap, and that was maybe their sincere intention. But there's a term coined in the old Soviet Union about communist sympathizers in Western countries. These people were called useful idiots. And it saddens me to say that the interviewers ended up being nothing more than corporate versions of this. For you see, they were just a cog in the marketing plan of a giant corporation that needed to do some damage control after a public relations disaster. First thing you do is control the narrative. And how best to do that than with folks who were given the illusion of perhaps being, crusading journalists, but were instead just an unpaid part of Hasbro's PR team.
See, I am not interested in being a mouthpiece through which Wizards of the Coast can do brand rehab after the OGL situation. They agreed to my terms, and those terms were this. First, I could ask anything I wanted, and questions didn't have to be reviewed or approved in advance. Second, I could record the interview and use that footage however I chose, but they couldn't use the footage at all for anything. And third, they did not get to see or approve this video before it went up.
What kind of logistics? Did I have to agree to stuff, screen things, promise to say this but not say this? No. It was very important to me and at least several of the other creators that we had basically full creative control over everything you see here.
We are here. He's here to talk about the OGL. He has said that nothing is off the table in terms of questions.
You got. You thought we were a bunch of suckers, but guess what?
It was clear, and I mean very clear, that Kyle had some talking points. And despite our friends colluding to not ask the same questions, isn't it funny how the same answers made their way into each of the interviews?
And looking at it and saying, well, actually, if the SRD isn't that damaging, why not just go Creative Commons and just end this conversation so we never have to have it again?
Sure.
Saying irrevocable probably isn't good enough because people might not even take our word for that. And so we decided, hey, let's do something that is mechanically irrevocable, that nobody has to take our word for it. It's just, this is how it works. And the Creative Commons was that road. By moving everything into the Creative Commons, we've just taken this whole discussion off the table. I mean, that's a one-way door. We can't unring that bell, which is why Creative Commons was such a great and easy solution for us. When one of the folks on the legal team suggested it, we all jumped on it right away because we realized, you know what, the open gaming license that's been around for 20 years kind of didn't give us any protection. We haven't got hurt by it so far. Why not just put it all in Creative Commons and put this to bed? And because Creative Commons is a great solution. It's, it takes a lot of the argument completely off the table. People can just go create, and we don't ever have to have this conversation again. We can just go make stuff. You know what? We're going to go to Creative Commons. They're professionals in this area. They know what they're doing. We'll use their license.
Right.
What these people didn't understand is that Wizards of the Coast knew that there was really only a narrow focus of questions that would arise. So, for example, when Kyle was expecting a question on the proposed and eventually rejected hateful content policy, he was very well prepared.
Which means there's a greater risk of exposure to hateful content and harm from hateful content. When you have a larger audience, that means you'll have a larger impact from negative content, from content that would be hateful or hurtful. The emergence of some hateful content that's coming around out there. So there's a couple things. One is because we know very well that there is content out there that can be quite hateful, that can be applied to D&D, much more diverse. So there's not only more people, but also more kinds of people, people from all kinds of different life experiences who need to be taken care of, who need to be given the welcoming, inclusive game that we have today. And we were very concerned about what hateful content might do to that audience as well.
Even more silly was the notion that nefarious corporations were ready to leap out of the shadows and seize the D&D brand while also utilizing new technology like NFTs, knowing full well that their own copyrights and trademarks are protected from people utilizing the OGL license in such a way. Disney can't make a third-party product for D&D and call it D&D. They can obliquely refer to its compatibility, and that's it. But that didn't stop Kyle from skillfully sounding the alarm bells in every interview. The interviewers thought that they were getting off-the-cuff answers. But as you can see in the totality of these interviews, they were getting what most of us knew they would. A carefully prepared corporate statement given legitimacy by, it again must be sadly said, useful idiots.
There have been a lot of new technologies that have come out since then. I mean, we didn't even have smartphones when the OGL was written. There's apps, there's NFTs, there's VR. It's also a much more attractive target for like an outside firm with significant resources to come in and go, well, that's an interesting market. Maybe I would like to step in there and use the opening of this OGL to dominate that market in some way. Deep-pocketed outsiders entering the space and changing the face of D&D for their own corporate needs. We were concerned about what new technologies could offer. There's a lot of scams in the NFT space, for example. We were worried about that, about people bringing scams into the D&D space. Yeah, so we still have a lot of real concerns about big media corps moving into the D&D space, new technologies that weren't considered when the OGL was first written. And when I say big media corps, I don't mean Wizards big. I mean like Meta big. I mean like Disney big. Let's say that you were a large social media company that had built an amazing social media platform, and then you would use those dollars to make a virtual reality metaverse, you might say. Let's say you were some unnamed company that had done all those things, and then you decided to make a D&D virtual reality space. Sure. So there are a lot of new technologies that have come around since the OGL came about. There have been apps. There have been video games. There has been virtual reality spaces. So let's say that somebody wanted to create a version of D&D where you would put on a virtual reality headset and you would play through your dungeon that way. What about a deep-pocketed outside actor coming into D&D and changing the face of D&D? There was concern that OGL 1.0a as written would permit that, would permit, like a multi-billion-dollar, conglomerate or media concern to come in and create, for example, a virtual reality space where you could play D&D, and then that would change the face of what D&D is, how it plays, without our being there to represent the community.
I'm sure Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast did their calculations on whether or not these were the types of people that would ask probing questions if they started to suspect that they were getting nothing but a talking point written by a PR person. And sure enough, big business almost always wins. None of these guys or gals, with maybe the slight exception of 3 black halflings in a few of their questions, challenged any of Kyle's answers. So in that respect, honestly, 3 black halflings is probably the only one that can rightfully place the term interview on their video. The rest were just varying degrees of conversation. Now, some of the others maybe started to suspect this. A couple of them made wraparound segments, essentially pointing out their own failure during the interview by lamenting the fact that they were not getting a truthful answer out of Kyle. Stuff they should have probed him on. But for whatever reason, they chose not to.
And we're going to be addressing concerns as they get raised. What we want to do is we want to keep taking action, and it needs to be relevant action. So we're going to be doing a lot of listening as well.
I'm going to be real with you, I was surprised by how weak this answer was. I think how are you planning to regain our trust was one of the most asked questions, and I thought they would have a really robust response prepared.
There's only so much actual risk. So the perceived risk was much higher than the actual risk is my real answer to that one. And therefore, Creative Commons is a great answer.
We then go on to say later on that risk was perceived to be significantly more than it actually was, and it was a late revelation. I have a hard time with this.
Oh, it was going to be a longer timeline. I mean, so the dates in the leaked document were already obsolete by the time it was out there.
But nah, it wasn't gonna be a longer timeline until, thankfully, those few publishers under NDAs told WotC those initial dates were a non-starter.
We did get a few mildly interesting things during the interview. Kyle said on his Three Black Halflings interview that he had gotten in trouble in the past for being a diversity champion.
And that's, I think, the responsibility of every senior leader, especially if we're going to grow as a society, to keep that door open, especially to marginalized folks. And in addition, we have anonymous feedback channels whereby people can raise issues if they don't feel safe doing so. But I take this extremely personally. I have gotten in trouble at other workplaces for maybe going too far as a leader in going after these things.
Now, I'm sure Kyle was just pandering, like he did in the comment about white dudes not leaving fast enough for the hobby. I feel legitimately bad for minorities who often get this spoonful of platitudes shoved down their throat. But in some respect, the political agenda of some of the YouTubers who interviewed Kyle seemed to be just as important to them as it was to finding any sort of truth regarding the real motivation behind the OGL fiasco.
Do you have equity and diversity targets so your team represents the general population? And that may be Hasbro or Wizards that has those. And do you look at like, well, our percentage of Hispanic is X percent, the country is Y percent, here's that gap to make up? Do you also as a corporation look at gender-based pay gaps and target those over time?
We're all in favor of diversity, but ultimately, I think what makes the difference in a company like this is if you have minority people in positions of power.
As you've seen through the practiced responses on the main talking points, Kyle is a company man. To a point. He also revealed himself to be a bit of a save-ass, too, when it was convenient.
The statement that came out on the Friday, I read it around the same time you did.
I just wondered, how did you feel when you read that? What did you think of it?
I was not pleased with what we had posted. So there's been a growing desire over the life of 10A to update it within Wizards. That desire's been there for a while, since much longer than I've been here. So this has been going on for some time. So I think we inherited some goals in this process. I've been at Wizards for 2 years, and it was in process when I got here a couple of years ago. So the OGL conversation I got into upon joining Wizards of the Coast. So that was 2 years ago. I began being looped into that conversation, and so I've been with it for that period of time as one of the people at the table.
Yes, he was very eager to say that he wasn't involved in the early desire to change the OGL. And I'm sure that's true, but when they put the title of executive producer on you and give you a commensurate salary, you take full responsibility. In other words, you use the term we instead of me or I. In addition to throwing his coworkers under the bus, he also threw the past of D&D under the bus, while also giving us some insight on how they're planning to destroy the game in the future.
Other thing is we have D&D has a long history. It's got a long and deep lore that goes back to some pretty troubling stuff. And so for the things that we publish, we have a thorough inclusion review process right now, where we have external inclusion reviewers, inclusivity reviewers, multiple, 2 or 3 usually, look over every word that we publish, give us a complete report on the things that we need to take action on. We figure out what we're going to take action on. We advise them of the things how we're taking action on their feedback, and then we publish it.
Now, I and others have covered how being beholden to diversity consultants who have a monetary and egotistical desire to say something, anything about the product that they're reviewing, is a good way to water down your product until it is an unrecognizable mess. And we all know, with their recent releases over the last couple years, that's exactly where Wizards of the Coast is at. During the interview with Bob, Kyle essentially said he was afraid to do an interview with D&D Shorts, which is quite illuminating. He did not want one probing question because he's a weak man. He panders and smiles while delivering the company line. And these guys all fell for it. It's like that old movie War Games from the 1980s. The only way to win is to not play the game. Or if you're going to play the game, you better at least be prepared to. And none of these guys were. I would have asked him a few things. I would have asked how anyone could possibly believe that the publicly stated desire to monetize D&D at the last shareholder meeting at the end of 2022 didn't have something to do with the push to change the OGL soon after. I'd have asked, if I had known it, for him to explain fully his comments about white dudes not being able to leave the hobby fast enough. I'd have asked in all candor why someone hasn't lost their job over this whole OGL issue. I mean, it has literally cost them millions of dollars. Why does Kyle still have his job? Why hasn't he given it to a minority? Well, that's all for now. I will put a link to all of these interviews down below, so you can check them out for yourself if you so desire. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. We will talk soon. Tonight is our first Castles and Crusades game. Yes, we have thrown off the yoke of D&D and Wizards of the Coast, and I gotta say, me and my whole group, we feel pretty good about that. So, you guys take care. We will catch up soon. Goodbye.
What qualifies you to be a U.S. Senator? You have 60 seconds.
Hi, good night, everybody.